June 27, 1743. The village of Dettingen, Bavaria. When British archaeologists excavated the old battlefield in 1923, they expected to find musket balls and regimental buttons. What they discovered instead sent ripples through the royal archives. A mass grave containing the skeletal remains of 17 massive dogs, each wearing ornate leather collars bearing the royal cipher of George II. The bones showed evidence of sword wounds, musket damage, and something far more disturbing, deliberate execution marks on every skull. The official records had been sanitized, the paintings romanticized, but buried correspondence between King George II and his master of hounds, discovered in a sealed chamber at Windsor Castle in 1958, told a different story about what really happened on that battlefield. About the pack of Irish wolfhounds that didn't just guard a king, they became instruments of something far darker. But the truth was far more terrible. Les had positioned themselves to trap the Allied forces in a bottleneck between the river and heavily wooded hills. On paper, it should have been a French victory. The pragmatic army found itself surrounded, supplies running low and retreat impossible. But George II, whether through courage or compulsion, decided to make his stand. As dawn broke on June 27th, the Royal Command Post was established on a slight rise overlooking the battlefield, and surrounding that post in a precise defensive formation stood 17 wolfhounds wearing specially commissioned leather armor plates across their chests and flanks. Soldiers who marched past that morning later reported an unsettling observation: the dogs weren't barking or straining at their leads. They sat in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on the tree line where French forces gathered. One Scottish infantryman, Private Andrew MacLeod, wrote in a letter discovered in 1967, "Those hounds watched the woods like they could see through them, like they knew something we didn't. Made my skin crawl worse than the thought of French bayonets." Escalating incidents, 8 minutes. The first incident occurred at approximately 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the battle commenced. Lieutenant William Thornton of the 3rd Foot Guards was making routine rounds near the command post when all 17 dogs suddenly rose to their feet in unison. No command had been given. No sound had been made. According to Thornton's official report, filed 3 days after the battle, the dogs oriented themselves toward a specific section of woodland, approximately 400 yards distant. They did not bark or growl, Thornton wrote. Instead, they produced a low, sustained tone unlike any sound I've heard from canines. It resonated in my chest. Several soldiers nearby covered their ears. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased, and the dogs resumed their seated positions. 10 minutes later, a French reconnaissance patrol was discovered in exactly the location the dogs had focused upon. The patrol consisted of 4 men who had somehow penetrated Allied lines during the night. When interrogated, one of the French soldiers, a corporal named Jean-Baptiste Mercier, made a statement that was subsequently struck from official records. According to a transcript preserved in Sir Edmund Blackwood's personal papers, Mercier claimed, "We heard the hounds from 400 meters. The sound, it was not of this world. It entered our minds. Pierre began to bleed from his nose. We were compelled to approach, though every instinct screamed to flee." The French corporal's statement was dismissed as stress-induced delusion, but what couldn't be dismissed was the physical evidence. All 4 men in the reconnaissance patrol had severe nosebleeds, burst capillaries in their eyes, and showed signs of profound disorientation despite having consumed no alcohol. The second incident unfolded as the battle began in earnest. The French forces, approximately 26,000 strong, initiated their assault at 7:00 a.m. The pragmatic army, numbering around 40,000 but trapped in a poor defensive position, began taking heavy casualties. King George, defying all protocol and the pleas of his advisors, mounted his horse and rode forward to rally his troops personally. What happened next was witnessed by hundreds of soldiers from multiple regiments, though official histories describe it quite differently. According to sanitized accounts, the king's presence inspired the troops, and the British forces managed to repel the French advance through superior discipline and firepower. The unsanitized accounts paint a far stranger picture. Captain Edward Harcourt of the Royal Horse Guards wrote in his private diary, sealed until 1943, "As His Majesty rode forward, the wolfhounds broke formation. I expected chaos. Instead, they moved with uncanny coordination, forming a protective ring that advanced with the king's horse. No handler directed them. No commands were given. They simply knew." French cavalry attempted to intercept His Majesty. The hounds did not attack as normal dogs would. They anticipated. A French officer raised his pistol at 20 paces. Before he could fire, 2 hounds had already closed the distance and brought down his horse. It was as if they perceived intent rather than action. Multiple accounts corroborate this observation. The dogs seemed to respond not to visible threats but to hostile intentions. A French officer, Lieutenant Colonel François Deroux, survived the battle and later wrote in his memoirs published in France in 1761 but never translated to English. The British king was protected by creatures that moved like shadows given form. Our best cavalrymen could not approach him. The beasts knew our strategies before we executed them. Some of my men threw down their weapons and refused to advance, claiming the king had summoned demons. The third incident occurred during the height of the battle, around 10:30 a.m. The French Maison du Roi cavalry, their elite household troops, made a concentrated push toward the command post. This was the moment of maximum danger for George II. If the command post fell, the Allied forces would likely collapse into disorganized retreat. Sergeant Thomas Wickham of the 1st Guards was positioned 50 yards from the command post when the French cavalry charge began. His testimony, given in 1744 during a closed military inquiry, describes events that strain credibility. The Wolfhounds formed a line between the king and the approaching French. Perhaps 24 cavalry bore down upon them. The dogs did not charge forward to meet them. They stood perfectly still, and that sound began again. That terrible bone-deep resonance. The French horses began to scream, not whinny or neigh, scream, like humans in terror. They reared, threw their riders, fled in panic. Some collapsed entirely, their legs giving out beneath them. Within seconds, the charge had become a disaster of trampled men and panicked animals. The dogs never moved from their positions. 7 French cavalry horses died during this incident, all from what post-battle examination determined to be sudden cardiac arrest. The French command, baffled and increasingly desperate, attributed it to British use of infernal devices, speculation that the British Army denied but never fully investigated. The 4th and most disturbing incident came as the battle turned decisively in favor of the Pragmatic Army. Around 1:00 p.m., the French forces began a fighting retreat across the main river. Victory was assured. Yet King George, rather than remaining at the command post as protocol dictated, insisted on pursuing the retreating enemy with a small contingent of guards. And he brought the dogs. Major Alexander MacDonald, who accompanied the king during this pursuit, later testified before the closed inquiry. His Majesty was not himself. His eyes held a fevered quality. He spoke in German, addressing the hounds by name, though I could not comprehend his words. We came upon a group of French wounded, perhaps a dozen men, unable to retreat, awaiting mercy or capture. The king dismounted. He walked among the wounded men, the dogs following close behind. I expected him to call for surgeons, to arrange for prisoners to be taken. Instead, he gestured toward a specific wounded soldier, a young man, barely 20, holding his shattered arm and weeping. His Majesty spoke a single word in German. I did not recognize it. The dogs converged on that man. What followed was efficient, mercifully brief. But it was not battle. It was execution. MacDonald's testimony continues. Before I could speak, before I could question this action, the king turned to me with an expression of such cold clarity that my words died in my throat. He said, in perfect English, "This one plotted against my person. The hounds sense treachery as you sense heat from flame. They have served justice." I looked up the dead Frenchman. He wore the uniform of a common infantryman. There was no evidence of treachery, no reason to single him out from the other wounded. Yet His Majesty was utterly convinced. And the dogs... They returned to his side and sat as disciplined as any guardsman, awaiting the next command. 3 more wounded French soldiers were singled out and killed in this manner before Major MacDonald managed to persuade the king to return to the command post. No official explanation was ever entered into the battle records. The French later claimed that Allied forces had executed wounded prisoners, but the British command categorically denied the charges. Technically true, as no British soldiers had carried out the killings. The battle ended in complete victory for the Pragmatic Army. King George II became the last British monarch to personally lead troops in battle, a moment that should have been celebrated as glorious triumph. Instead, the king's closest advisors noted a disturbing change in His Majesty's demeanor. Lord Carteret, who served as Secretary of State, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, "The king speaks to those beasts as confidants. He insists they revealed French spies among our own ranks. 3 men have been arrested on no evidence save the dogs' behavior toward them. I fear His Majesty's mind has been affected by the strain of battle. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The events at Dettingen spiral into something far darker than mere battlefield paranoia. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries hidden in royal history. Let's discover what happens next, because what King George II did after returning to England would remain concealed from the public for over 2 centuries. The official version of history records that King George II returned to London in November 1743 to great celebration. Parliament commissioned paintings commemorating the victory. Handel composed a Dettingen Te Deum. The king's personal courage became the subject of poems and songs throughout Britain. But within the royal household, something had shifted fundamentally. The master of the kennel, Sir Edmund Blackwood, became increasingly alarmed by the king's relationship with the Wolfhounds. His journal entries from December 1743 through March 1744 chart a progression from concern to horror. December 8, 1743. His Majesty spends 3 hours daily in the kennels. He dismisses all handlers and speaks with the hounds in German. I have observed that he does not merely speak to them, but appears to be in conversation, pausing, as if listening to responses inaudible to others. The dog's behavior has changed since Dettingen. They move with uncanny synchronization. They refuse food from anyone but His Majesty. January 15, 1744, the king has ordered construction of a private chamber adjacent to the kennels. He claims to require a space for research into canine military applications. When I inquired what research, he became enraged and threatened to have me removed from my position. That evening I heard sounds from the new chamber, rhythmic chanting in what I believed to be German, though the words seemed older, harsher than any German I have heard. February 3, 1744. 3 members of the Privy Council have died in the past month. Lord Wilmington of heart failure, Sir Charles Wager of sudden illness, and now Lord Gower of what physicians call apoplexy. All 3 had opposed His Majesty's proposals for increased military spending on what he terms special forces. All 3 showed the same, unusual symptoms before death: severe headaches, nosebleeds, paranoid delusions of being watched. I have noticed that the king's favored hounds were present at court on each occasion these men began showing symptoms. March 28, 1744, I can no longer remain silent. What I witnessed tonight confirms my darkest fears. I went to the kennels at midnight, hearing sounds of distress. I found His Majesty in the private chamber with all 17 hounds arranged in a circular formation. A portrait of his son, Prince Frederick, rested in the center of the circle. The king was speaking in that harsh, ancient-sounding language, and the dogs were producing that resonant tone, the same witnesses described at Dettingen. The portrait began to smolder, though no flame was present. The king's eyes reflected no light from the lanterns. He turned to me and smiled, a smile that held no warmth, no humanity. He said, "My dear Sir Edmund, you worry too much. The dogs and I understand each other perfectly now. They show me who threatens the realm. They help me protect what is mine." I fled. I am writing this before going to the Archbishop. Something malevolent has taken root in. Sir Edmund Blackwood's journal ends mid-sentence. He was found dead in his quarters on March 29, 1744. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure. He was 32 years old with no history of heart disease. The post-mortem examination noted unusual hemorrhaging in the brain and burst blood vessels throughout the eyes and nose. The journal was confiscated by royal order and disappeared into the archives, not to resurface until 1958, when a historian researching George II's military campaigns discovered it misfiled in a collection of household expense records. But Sir Edmund's death was only the beginning of the systematic cover-up. In April 1744, all 17 wolfhounds were quietly removed from Kensington Palace. The official explanation was that they were being retired to the countryside. The Master of the Rolls recorded payment for their transport to a private estate in Yorkshire. Except no estate in Yorkshire ever received them. No further breeding records exist. No paintings were commissioned of these dogs that had supposedly saved their king in battle. For animals that should have been celebrated as heroes, they vanished from history, with suspicious completeness. The truth emerged piecemeal over the next 2 centuries. In 1867, during renovation of Windsor Castle, workers discovered a sealed chamber in the North Terrace. Inside were 17 dog collars, each bearing the royal cipher, each showing significant damage from blade weapons. Also discovered was a locked chest containing correspondence between King George II and a German occultist named Johann Georg Faust the Younger. not the legendary Faust of literature, but a real historical figure who practiced what he termed psychical animal magnetism. The letters, written between 1741 and 1744, detail the king's obsession with creating an incorruptible guardian force that could not be bribed, could not betray, and could sense treachery before it manifested into action. Faust provided instructions for rituals that would bind the essence of the guardian hounds to the sovereign will, creating perfect instruments of royal protection. The final letter in the collection, dated March 1744, was from Faust to the king. It reads in part, "Your Majesty must understand that the binding has gone too deep. The hounds no longer distinguish between genuine threat and your Majesty's paranoid suspicions. They have become extensions of your darkest impulses. They sense not treachery but disfavor. Anyone who opposes your will they perceive as existential threat. You must break the binding, or the hounds will eventually turn on those you most cherish." Attached to this letter was a brief note in King George's handwriting. "The problem has been addressed. The instruments are no more." The most disturbing discovery came in 1923, when the Dettingen battlefield was excavated as part of a broader archaeological study of 18th century warfare. The mass grave containing 17 large dog skeletons was located exactly where historical maps placed King George II's command post. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the German archaeologist who led the excavation, wrote in his report, "Each skeleton shows evidence of battlefield trauma, sword wounds, musket ball impacts, damaged ribs consistent with cavalry combat. However, all 17 skulls bear identical marks, a single puncture wound to the rear of the cranium, consistent with a spike or AWL driven directly into the brain. The angles suggest the animals were restrained and executed systematically by someone approaching from behind while they were focused forward. More disturbing are the chemical traces. Analysis of the bone marrow reveals unusually high concentrations of mercury and antimony, substances associated with alchemical practices of the period. The collars found with the remains show evidence of having held small pouches, now deteriorated, but residue suggests they contained a mixture of herbs and metals consistent with 18th century occult protection charms. Dr. Muller's conclusion was suppressed by the British Museum and the Royal Archives. Though copies of his report survived in German academic institutions, these animals were not simply war dogs. They were subjects of some form of experimental treatment, possibly alchemical or protochemical in nature. The manner of their death suggests they were executed by someone they trusted, approached from behind while they maintained their trained forward vigilance. Given the location and the royal ciphers on their collars, the most logical conclusion is that King George II personally ordered their destruction immediately following the Battle of Dettingen. The historical record shows no formal investigation into the events surrounding the war dogs or Sir Edmund Blackwood's death. This absence itself is telling. In an era when royal household accounts meticulously recorded the purchase of every candle and the payment of every servant, the sudden disappearance of 17 valuable animals that had served in a major battle drew no official inquiry, no explanation beyond the vague mention of retirement. However, private correspondence among the king's closest advisors reveals a different story. Lord Carteret's papers, unsealed in 1943, contain a series of letters exchanged with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Herring, throughout 1744. These letters speak carefully, using coded language, but their meaning is clear enough to historians familiar with the period's political tensions. In a letter dated April 15, 1744, Carteret wrote, "The matter of the guardians has been resolved. His Majesty traveled privately to Hanover in early April. He returned alone. The Archbishop of Mainz performed certain rites that His Majesty believes have restored balance. Whether these rites were of Christian nature or something older I cannot say. His Majesty refuses to discuss the particulars." Archbishop Herring's response, dated April 30th, reveals even more. "I am relieved the instruments have been retired, yet I remain troubled. The king speaks of them as if they were soldiers who knew too much and had to be silenced. Lord Carteret, you and I both know what Sir Edmund was about to reveal before his untimely death. If half of what he wrote in that journal is true, His Majesty engaged in practices that verge on the diabolical. Yet what can be done? We cannot accuse the king of witchcraft or consorting with dark forces. The political implications would tear the kingdom apart. I have arranged for all related documents to be sealed in the Windsor archives, accessible only by royal permission. Future generations may judge these events more clearly. For now we must ensure stability and pray that His Majesty's fascinations lie dormant." But George II's fascinations did not lie dormant. They merely became more carefully concealed. Military records show that between 1744 and his death in 1760, the king repeatedly attempted to establish what he called specialized reconnaissance units that would be trained in psychological observation techniques. These proposals were consistently blocked by Parliament and military leadership, who found the concept both impractical and disturbingly vague. Major Alexander MacDonald, who had witnessed the executions of French prisoners at Dettingen, resigned his commission in October 1744. His letter of resignation, filed with the War Office, is extraordinarily brief. "I can no longer serve in good conscience." He never spoke publicly about his experiences at Dettingen, but his grandson discovered a sealed letter among his effects after MacDonald's death in 1779. The letter, now held at the National Army Museum, was addressed to MacDonald's wife. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, I have passed beyond the reach of earthly powers, and can finally tell you what I witnessed in Bavaria. The king, our sovereign, whom I was sworn to protect, used those hounds as instruments of murder. Not in battle, where killing is necessity and duty, but as tools of execution based on nothing more than paranoid suspicion. The dogs sense something, I do not doubt that. Animals perceive what we cannot. But whatever the king did to enhance that perception, whatever rituals or treatments Faust administered, it did not make them more accurate. It made them extensions of the king's own fears and hatreds. They reflected his suspicions back to him as certainty." 3 men in our own forces disappeared after Dettingen. The official record says they deserted. I know better. I saw the king direct those hounds toward them with the same cold precision he used on the French wounded. Those men were loyal soldiers whose only crime was expressing private doubts about the king's fitness for command. The dogs sensed treachery because the king suspected treachery, and the ritual binding made them incapable of distinguishing between their master's intuition and reality. I fear for England. A monarch who believes he possesses supernatural means of detecting threats is a monarch who will see threats everywhere. That the king destroyed the hounds suggests some remaining shred of reason, or perhaps just fear of what he had created. But the impulse that led him to create them remains. MacDonald's fears were not entirely unfounded. George II's later years were marked by increasing paranoia and conflicts with his son, Prince Frederick, who died suddenly in 1751. Historical analysis has never found evidence of foul play in Frederick's death. He died of an abscess in the lung after being hit by a cricket ball. But the timing was convenient for a king who had increasingly viewed his heir as a political threat. The broader investigation that should have followed the Dettingen incidents never materialized because the primary witnesses were either dead, complicit, or terrified of retribution. The French military command filed formal complaints about the execution of prisoners, but the British government categorically denied the charges. Without bodies or living witnesses willing to testify, the matter was dropped as wartime propaganda. In 1758, the French published a pamphlet alleging that George II had used diabolical means during the Battle of Dettingen, including demons in the guise of hounds. The British government denounced it as French war propaganda and used it as evidence of enemy attempts to undermine public confidence in the crown. The pamphlet was banned in Britain, and possession of it became grounds for arrest under sedition laws. Ironically, the French accusations, though rooted in truth, were so sensational that they inoculated the British public against believing any criticism of the king's conduct at Dettingen. When actual evidence began to surface decades later, it was dismissed as reheated French propaganda. The Hanoverian connection provided one final piece of the puzzle. In 1952, a German historian named Dr. Klaus Weber discovered records in the Niedersächsisches Landesarchiv in Hanover detailing payments made by George II to the Catholic Church in Bavaria in April 1744. The payments were substantial, equivalent to approximately 50,000 in period CU Renzi, and were made to the Diocese of Mainz for spiritual services rendered. Dr. Weber's research revealed that these spiritual services included an exorcism ritual performed on April 7, 1744, at a private chapel near the Dettingen battlefield. The ritual was conducted by a team of priests led by the Archbishop of Mainz himself. Historical records indicate that 17 possessed objects were subjected to the rite, then buried in consecrated ground. The chapel records note that the Archbishop reported to Rome that the ritual was successful, but that the corruption had run deeper than anticipated, and the objects required not merely cleansing but complete destruction to prevent residual influence. This report matches the archaeological evidence from the 1923 excavation. The dogs were not merely killed, but subjected to extensive post-mortem destruction. including severing of major bones and burning of tissue, consistent with exorcism practices of the period. George II's relationship with his remaining family members deteriorated significantly after 1744. His grandson, the future George III, was kept at arm's length, with the king expressing frequent concerns about corruption in the bloodline and the need for vigilant protection against unseen threats. Modern historians have interpreted this as early signs of the porphyria that would later afflict George III, possibly inherited from his grandfather. But contemporary observers saw it differently. They believed George II had become genuinely paranoid, seeing threats in every shadow. The king's final years were marked by isolation and increasing eccentricity. He died on October 25, 1760, at the age of 76. His death was sudden. He collapsed in his private chambers at Kensington Palace. The official cause was an aortic aneurysm. However, his personal physician noted in his private diary that the king had been experiencing severe headaches and nosebleeds in the weeks before his death, the same symptoms Sir Edmund Blackwood had reported before his own death, and the same symptoms witnesses at Dettingen had experienced. Lord Waldegrave, who had become the king's closest confidant in his final years, wrote after George's death, "His Majesty's last words to me were spoken 3 days before he passed. He clutched my hand with surprising strength and said, 'The dogs were right about Frederick. They were right about the others. But they could not distinguish between threats that were real and threats that were merely possible. That is the danger of power that operates beyond reason. It sees danger everywhere and makes no distinction between what must be stopped and what might be forgiven.' I asked him what he meant. He only said, 'I destroyed them, but the binding does not end with death. Tell no one what I have told you.' The Dettingen War Dogs incident represents one of the most thoroughly concealed episodes in British royal history, but its implications extend far beyond one monarch's bizarre experiment with occult military tactics. The episode reveals the dangerous intersection of absolute power, paranoia, and the willingness to embrace supernatural solutions to political problems. George II was not insane. By all accounts, he remained a capable administrator and reasonably effective monarch until his death. What he was desperate. Desperate for security in an age when assassination was a real threat, when court intrigue could topple dynasties, and when even family members might harbor treasonous ambitions. This desperation led him to seek certainty where certainty does not exist, in the ability to know, beyond doubt, who posed a genuine threat to his person and crown. The tragedy is that he believed he had found it, in a pack of dogs trained through methods that blurred the line between animal conditioning and occult ritual. Modern psychological analysis of George II's behavior patterns suggests he may have suffered from what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorder with paranoid features, possibly exacerbated by the genuine stresses of his position. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist specializing in historical figures, published a paper in 2015 analyzing George II's documented behaviors. She concluded, "The king displayed classic signs of someone experiencing what we call hypervigilance, a state of constant anxiety about potential threats. The Dettingen dogs became a coping mechanism, a way to outsource the exhausting mental work of threat assessment to external agents he believed possessed supernatural accuracy. The tragedy is that this coping mechanism reinforced his paranoia rather than alleviating it. When the dogs reacted to someone, George interpreted it as confirmation of genuine threat, never considering that the dogs might be responding to his own unconscious signals, his body language, his tone, his subconscious cues about who he feared or distrusted. He created a feedback loop where his own paranoia was reflected back to him as objective truth. The incident also raises profound questions about the ethics of military research, questions that remain relevant today. What George II attempted was, in essence, the creation of perfect lie detectors and threat assessors through a combination of animal training and pseudoscientific enhancement. The fact that his methods involved occult rituals rather than modern technology doesn't change the fundamental ethical problem, the attempt to create infallible instruments of security judgment. In the 21st century, governments and militaries around the world continue to research technologies claiming to detect deception, assess threats, and identify malicious intent before actions occur. From AI-powered surveillance systems to brain-scanning technologies, the ghost of George II's war dogs haunts our modern security apparatus. The fundamental question remains the same. Can we create systems that accurately distinguish between genuine threats and mere possibilities, between people who will cause harm and people who merely might? The answer, if history teaches us anything, is no. Every system humans have devised for detecting threats before they manifest, from George II's occult-trained hounds to modern predictive policing algorithms, has proven vulnerable to the same flaw. They reflect the biases, fears, and assumptions of their creators back as objective truth. The Dettingen incident also had lasting effects on military animal use. After 1744, the British military became notably reluctant to incorporate dogs into combat operations in ways that went beyond simple tasks like message carrying or guarding. This reluctance persisted until World War I, when military necessity finally overcame institutional memory. But even then, the use of animals in warfare remained strictly utilitarian, with no attempts to enhance their capabilities through experimental methods. The incident influenced British occult practices as well. The early 18th century had seen something of a revival in aristocratic interest in alchemy, astrology, and various forms of magic, often blending with early scientific inquiry. George II's disastrous experiment with occult animal enhancement had a chilling effect on such pursuits within the British establishment. By the late 18th century, any hint of occult practices among the aristocracy or military leadership became cause for scandal and removal from position. This suppression may have actually hindered early psychological and behavioral science research in Britain. Legitimate inquiry into animal cognition, training psychology, and behavioral conditioning became tainted by association with occult practices. British scientists lagged behind their continental counterparts in these fields throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, possibly because institutional memory of the Dettingen incident made authorities deeply suspicious of any research that seemed to blur the line between natural and supernatural. The cover-up itself set precedents for how the British establishment handles scandals involving the royal family. The systematic suppression of evidence, the sealing of documents, the destruction of records, and the strategic release of sanitized narratives, all techniques on full display in the Dettingen aftermath, became standard operating procedure for managing royal controversies. Modern British historians have identified the Dettingen cover-up as a template that was reused, with variations, during scandals involving George III's mental illness, George IV's marital problems, and various 20th century royal controversies. The human cost of the incident is impossible to calculate precisely. Sir Edmund Blackwood certainly died because he knew too much. The 3 British soldiers who disappeared after Dettingen were likely killed on the king's orders, executed by the very hounds that were supposed to protect the army. The French prisoners murdered after the battle were victims of a monarch's paranoid certainty that his supernatural instruments of judgment were infallible. And the dogs themselves, creatures that by all accounts performed their protective functions with extraordinary effectiveness during the battle, were ultimately destroyed not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well, becoming mirrors that reflected their master's darkest impulses back to him without filter or restraint. Perhaps the most disturbing implication is this: George II's experiment didn't fail because the dogs couldn't detect threats. The evidence suggests they could indeed sense hostile intent, fear, and aggression with uncanny accuracy. The experiment failed because the king confused threat detection with threat validity. The dogs sensed when people feared or distrusted the king, entirely reasonable reactions to a temperamental monarch with absolute power. But George interpreted these detections as proof of treachery worthy of death. In seeking perfect security through supernatural means, George II created perfect tyranny. That he ultimately recognized this and destroyed his creation suggests he retained some moral compass. But the 17 graves at Dettingen stand as a permanent reminder. The pursuit of absolute certainty in matters of security and loyalty is itself a threat, perhaps the greatest threat, to human justice and mercy. What do you think drove King George II to embrace such dark practices? Was it genuine paranoia, the burden of absolute power, or something else that made Britain's last warrior king turn to occult solutions for political problems? Leave your theories in the comments below. The Dettingen war dogs represent one of history's most thoroughly buried secrets, a moment when a powerful ruler believed he had found supernatural certainty in an uncertain world, only to discover that absolute power over life and death, even when delegated to supposedly infallible instruments, corrupts absolutely. If you want to explore more lost chapters where power and paranoia collided with tragic results, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Sermon. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. And if this story left you with chills, share it with someone who appreciates the mysteries hiding in plain sight within royal history. The 17 dog collars bearing the royal cipher remain in the Windsor archives, sealed away from public view. The British royal family has never officially commented on the Dettingen war dogs. Perhaps some secrets, they believe, are better left buried. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story that history tried to forget.